Good evening. In this episode, and in the next one, we will sketch the history of the Borgia family. As you know, the Borgias have entered into history as one of the most corrupt families of the historical period in struggle during the era of the Middle Ages to the era of the era of the France. We're talking about the 1400s and the beginning of the 1500s. The Borgia family was extended and extensive, but the characters that have given fame, notoriousness, or maybe even infamy to the family are three: Pope Alexander VI, his daughter Lucretia, and one of his sons, Pesaro, better known as Valentina, without counting the multiple respective others. The name Valentina was Italianized translation of the French Valentina, so after the contorted sequence of alliances, betrayals, shifting of allegiances, battles, murders, and adventures, Pesaro became the Duke of Milan from Valence, the French town along the Rhone. Lucretia has acquired a name as an expert in poisons, and she was married actually 3 times. Her first 2 marriages were rocky and controversial. The third, to the Duke of Pesaro, Alfonso X, whom she is known, lasted the longest until her death. Let us begin with a brief perspective on the general status and political temperature of Italy and of the year of the times. We should note that in the short period of 50 years from 1490 to 1540, some epoch-making events took place. Events carried on by epoch, which is like epoch-making people. In 1492, as you know, Columbus discovered America, and we know what that discovery meant for Europe and for the unfortunate natives. Leonardo da Vinci was fully active in this period. He died in Amboise in France in 1519, cared for by his benefactor, King Francis I, who loved Leonardo's painting, but perhaps even more his military inventions. Leonardo is, of course, the essence and the quintessence of the Renaissance. While in France, he even managed to design one of the most beautiful and impressive castles of the lived while, the castle of St. Louis. Other big names in art were Raphael, the painter, Michelangelo, painter, poet, sculptor, and architect, and many others equally original and unequaled masters in their art. In 1510, Ludovico traveled to Rome and actually saw Raphael at work. However, as you know, he was so disgusted by what he perceived to be the rottenness and the corruption of the church that on October 31st of 1517, 500 years ago, he issued the famous protest on the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg. In the same period, Spain and France disputed among themselves who should be the nation on the continent of Europe. Spain won when Emperor Charles V defeated Francis I at the Battle of Pesaro. In 1534, King Henry VIII carried out his own reformation, detaching himself from Rome and creating the Church of England. And finally, the Catholic Church, seeing the rapid weakening of its power and the threat of dissolution compared to the Council of Trent in 1545. Theoretically, the council was to reconcile Catholicism and Protestantism, and it lasted 18 years, but likely it left nowhere as far as the reconciliation is concerned. It triggered about 100 years of religious wars which devastated Europe, especially France, in what today we call Middle Europe. It ended, so to speak, in 1640, with the peace of Westphalia. And now to the Borgia family and to its most famous and notorious member, Pope Alexander VI. The Borgia family was Spanish. Their home was Valencia hometown. He was born in 1431, the son of 2 cousins belonging to Spain's local nobility. His real name was Rodrigo, and so he chose the name Alexander after Alexander the Macedon, and well as an earlier Pope, Alexander III, who was a fierce enemy, by the way, of the German Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa. No one, when Alexander VI was elected, could imagine the impact, for good or for bad, he made on the Catholic Church. He had studied theology in Rome, in Bologna, and quickly became Cardinal of Valencia in Spain and Vice-Chancellor of the Church. Each Catholic cardinal was assigned, as you may know, a church in Rome as well as the church of which he was also cardinal of in other parts of the world. Alexander VI was in that part due to the influence of his maternal uncle, another Pope, Calixtus III, who told Alexander to learn from Valencia. In the 15th century, it was quite normal that popes had a number of natural sons from different mothers, and it is true that the issues of priest celibacy was one of the causes of the split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church in the season of 1300 years before. And we deal with without choosing the agreements, as far as sketch. The Orthodox themselves were opposed to celibacy, so the Catholic wanted to celibacy. So that mandatory celibacy remained mostly unenforced, and theoretical became effective after the Council of Trent in 1345. Incidentally, we know that the word nepotism refers to the widespread practice by authorities, then as well as now, to favor their position and emoluments members of the family. But nepotism derives from the Latin word nepos, meaning nephew. While nephew is not, for example, the equivalent of the English word, a word rather relative to indicate this practice. And that is the answer is very simple. When popes had sons from their lovers, they could not acknowledge them as such, for the practice would make a mockery of the children. Hence they pretended that their sons were actually their nephews. Lucrezia Borgia had several lovers, none of them actually known. From the women who remained unknown, he had two daughters and one son, and the girls were married into the Roman nobility. One of them, called Luigi, became the Duke of Milan, which is corrected in the Spanish town of Valencia. One of the better known among Alexander's lover's sons, one of the Alexander's lovers was a lady by the name of Lucrezia Borgia, who gave him his most famous sons, namely children, Cesare, Juan, and Raphael, the three sons. From a subsequent and equally famous lover, Giovanni Sforza, called Isabella the Beautiful, Alexander had another daughter by the name of Laura. So as you see, the picture was quite prolific. The story of Borgia, which is the Roman relation of Milan, is interesting. She was blonde, and her family came from Lombardy, and her relationship with Alexander began in 1470 and ended in 1485. Once he became pope, he took care of her by securing for her a substantial income, which enabled her, among other things, to open several restaurants, locandi, as they were called at the time, the kind of restaurant chain before its time. Alexander had also married 3 times afterwards to prevent, or at least to soften, any rumors concerning his own sons from Vannozzo. Her first 2 husbands are actually secretaries in the Vatican Curia. For accurate information, the Curia is synonymous of an ecclesiastical office, but the origin of the word is actually Etruscan, and it means the things built together. Vannozzo lived in Santiago Palace. This one called the Santa Maria Portico, which you may agree is not a nice reason for me to like the Pope. However, Alexander actually charged his cousin, by the name of Adriano de Lima, with the education of his sons, and especially of his daughter, Lucrezia. Adriano, in turn, was the wife of Ludovico Orsini, belonging to one of the most illustrious noble families of Rome. In turn, the son of Adriano and Ludovico, was called Orsini, became the husband of Giulia Farnese, who was another steady Giulia lived in Rosanello, in the beautiful area of central Italy near Rome. Here is the castle in Rosanello. And here is a piece of 15th century Gothic. So Alexander had Julia Farnese, one of the as well, very as we know, Lord of Rosanello, which you just see. And this place, so today, he continued to be beloved after her death. And there are excellent letters where the Pope shows jealousy and it knows to Julia not to have intimate relations with her husband. And when Julia was in her castle in Capodimonte, the Pope ordered her to return to Rome. And when she said that she couldn't because her husband couldn't let her return to Rome, in another letter, the Pope wonders how could Julia prefer that monkey than her husband himself, the Pope. And yet in another letter, when Julia went to Pesaro, accompanying Lucretia in her first baptism, the Pope even threatened her excommunication if she could not return to Rome as soon as possible. And here is another piece of historical record, along with the Borgias, and even more so, the Farnese are members of an important family in Italy, both in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Julia Farnese's brother became Pope Paul III in 1533. And you can see, by the way, he started the Council of Trent in 1525. And he also treated Council Farnese. As viewers may know and remember, during the Renaissance in general and during the 16th century in particular, printers in Scotland were very generous and they say almost uninhibited in showing quite a bit of stress and nudity in paintings, sculptures and churches. When Pope Paul III, Julia Farnese's cousin died, his tomb in St. Peter was embellished by two flags, as you can see. One representing justice and truth, and the one on the right representing prudence. According to popular tradition, model for the statue of justice was the Pope's sister Julia Farnese, who had been delivered of Alexander I. In its original form, justice was originated. However, after the Council of Trent, with the Counter-Reformation, the statue of justice was deemed to be indecent, and the Pope of the time, by Clement VIII, ordered the nudity coded in the home. But the story does not end here, because pilgrims and tourists continue to travel to Rome from all over Europe, Protestants, Catholics, and visitors knew that the metal on the statue of justice was an afterthought on the cover. But at a certain hour of the day, when the main tourist traffic ended, it was possible to pay the custodian, and for a fee equivalent to about today $1, the custodian removed temporarily the metal cover to reveal the statue of Julia Farnese of justice, if you like, in its own original. Perfect. Back to the main story. In 1471, Borgia, then still a cardinal, went to Spain to supply the banishment of the Moors of ancient Spain in the conquest of Granada. He was elected Pope in 1492, the same year when Columbus discovered America. Once elected, Alexander VI did not hesitate to recognize his nephews and his sons as those he had in the hospital. He immediately appointed his son Ludovico to be cardinal of Valencia in Spain, and this was indispensable because the canonical law did not permit the legitimate son to become cardinal. But, as we all know, but it does not hurt to repeat it, history written or narrated for 100 years after his death must be back, like one sources, and defended some collected and dated at the time. It will be the home, I think, 100 years from now, some historians will claim that America wanted to transport democracy over the world by the religion changes, and others will claim that it was simply implemented. As far as the Borgia family, the contemporary historians of the period were critical of the Borgias, with a gentleman by the name of Stefano Sforza, who wrote the diary of the city of Rome. And in his chronicles, he writes down everything that happened or that was supposed to have happened. Though the chronicle chronicler was better known by the name of Francesco Urbino. In his history of Italy, we owe the very dark narrative of the lives of Alexander VI, his son Cesare and his daughter Lucrezia Borgia. However, documentation, especially on the more salacious, like morbid events in which the Borgias were involved, the documentation is extended, especially from reports by ambassadors, doctors, military on the spot with different characters. And one of his characters was a gentleman by the name of Johann Burka, the German, and Strasbourg, who was the ceremonier, rather than the master of the ceremonies at the Vatican court. But he was also scrupulous record keeper of expenses and events. Also, the ambassador's reports, by and large, are consistent with the main events which have labeled the Borgias as eminently corrupt. In particular, the ambassadors of the Republic of Venice are one of the best sources for detailed adopted information on the history of Europe, notably of this state where Venice kept ambassadors. Alexander VI is so intertwined with the history of his sons and of his son's daughter Lucretia that even in this short historical edition we cannot easily separate them from one another. Cesare was not absolute a lofty pursuit. He loved hunting, women, and wine, and as for the men, also his father. The second son, Juan, was given a duchy in Spain and married cousin of the Catholic king, Ferdinand and Isabel of Aragon. It was they, by the way, Ferdinand and Isabel, who financed Columbus' expedition to America. In her first marriage with Lucretia Borgia, she became the wife of Giovanni Sforza, Duke of Pesaro, and later on the Adriatic Sea. I should interject here a brief account of the general political status and conditions in Italy at the time of the transition between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Italy was technically part of the Western Roman Empire, with emperors were traditionally Germans. With time, however, Germany had lost much of its influence, and in that place, the Catholic Church became the exceptional state of the time period, with very strong direct influence in Italy, of course, and indirect influence in France, Spain, England, Germany, and Central Europe. In Italy, government was subdivided among various states, some more powerful than others, notably Venice, Florence, and Milan, were all under the spiritual and various degrees political control of the Pope. In the states of the Church proper, various towns and principalities were ruled by feudal families which, at one time or another, claimed or acted as if they were more or less independent of the Pope. In this context, the marriage of Lucretia Borgia to Giovanni Sforza, Duke of Pesaro, was intended to strengthen the relation between the relationship of the papacy with the powerful rulers of Milan, to whose family Giovanni Sforza belonged. But it was also a gesture of gratitude as the election of Pope Alexander VI was in part due to the lobbying of the notorious Cardinal Sforza, Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan, was called Ludovico Moro. These alliances were anything but stable and changed quickly according to the political wind at any one time. And the twists and the interconnections were so intricate that every episode would almost require a strict book to explain the reasons, the connections, fights, interferences, and the shenanigans that eventually led to this or that marriage, to this or that war, to this or that assassination. And here is another piece of information that I suspect many people do not know. In 1493, the Pope, under the request of the extremely Christian majesties of Spain and Portugal, issued a bull establishing the respective power and jurisdiction of Spain and Portugal in the newly discovered America, South America. And he says that for South America, because the North began to be noticed as being aquatic places, especially Canada and the United States. Anyway, the papal bull established an imaginary line from the Arctic to the Antarctic, passing 100 leagues west of the Azores Islands. And this line was then adjusted 1 year later under the Treaty of Tordesillas. According to the treaty, the lands to the west of the line in the picture belong to Spain, and the lands to the east belong to Portugal, which, by the way, is the reason why Brazil speaks Portuguese and Argentina and all the other countries of South America speak Spanish. In the year 1494, another event stirred the political waters in Italy. Ferdinand, the King of Naples, died, and Naples was ruled by the Spanish family of the Aragon branch. The Pope recognized the rights of the Ferdinand family, the sons, particularly Alfonso of Calabria, but pretended in exchange that one of the other sons of the Pope, Cardinal Ascanio, would marry the natural daughter of the King of Milan, who was Alfonso. By so doing, the Pope's son would acquire the duchy in the south of Italy. This was also doing very well, except that before the Spaniards, the French essentially ruled the southern Italy under the house of Anjou, and the current King of France, Charles VIII, claimed Naples as the dominion of France, which had been sold before the end of the Spanish conquest of 1442. Charles VIII, as his history would say, did not let idea wait upon a will. He quickly descended into Italy, and the efforts of the Pope to create a league, the League of St. Mark, of opposing and maintaining equilibrium among the Italian states, when that league went the way of its flesh. And here is another example of the complex intrigues of the time. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Moro, was technically a regent in behalf of his nephew by the name of Galeazzo. But Galeazzo was held prisoner to Pavia, south of Milan, and in turn Galeazzo was married to Isabella, who was the daughter of the new King of Naples, Alfonso. He expected to become the Duchess of Milan once Ludovico Moro, the regent, installed his nephew Galeazzo as the rightful ruler. And here, the Ludovico Moro of Milan, fearful of the King of Naples, father of Isabella, his daughter-in-law, Ludovico called in Charles VIII, King of France, and his army. Charles was more than happy to oblige, catching two birds with a stone, helping a friend and useful relying on them, and then proceeding to Naples to claim the unbidden throne usurped by the Spaniards. Charles VIII found the obstacles in his march through Italy. However, in Florence, as a consequence of the approach of Charles VIII, Piero de' Medici, son of the quintessential Renaissance prince Lorenzo de' Medici, Piero was forced to flee after a popular revolt. And that revolution brought to power a charismatic friar who left his name in history and many chronicles of interesting, odd, and tragic characters by the name of Giovanni Sforza. When Charles VIII reached Rome, the Pope had shut himself up into the fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo and refused any compromise with the king, who, by the way, intended to convene the cardinals and depose Alexander VI for simony. For theology, simony is a word indicating the acquisition of power in exchange for money or favor. It derives from the name from Simon the magician, who mentioned to Christianity. Anyway, the trial of Alexander for simony turned out to be impractical because most of the electoral cardinals were involved in simony themselves in one way or another. Actually, many cardinals liked the idea of Charles VIII prompting the election of another pope. And as we saw in a previous historical sketch, where we discussed the Council of Constance, held in 1415, there were three popes, each claiming to be the true pope, and the real representative of Christ. In the end, Alexander agreed to let Charles VIII cross the Papal territory to reach Naples, but King Charles asked that the Pope's son Theodore should accompany him as a hostage if he trusted him too much. And here is another event, which contributes to make even more mysterious or sinister the papacy of Alexander VI. For reasons not well ascertained, the Pope consigned to the French king a Turkish prince by the name of Ben, who in turn was the brother of the Turkish sultan of the time by the name of Bayezid II. Bayezid had defeated the brother Jem in a civil war in Turkey, and Jem had fled to Rome and was a live-in guest of the capital. The sultan ducats per year to make sure the gem was well controlled and did not escape. Why the Pope wanted to get rid of the hostage will never be known. A plausible theory is that Charles VIII, the French king, planned to turn a crusade to reconquer the Holy Land and Constantinople after it fallen to Lucrezia in 1253. Charles could not have planned a counter-revolution using rather bio-religious systems as a tool. In any event, the Turkish prince John was found dead near Capua, while the French army was advancing towards Naples. And this event helped, as I said before, among others, to create a black legend surrounding the Borgia family. This time we will continue with the fruits of the Pope and of the notorious family, especially the adventures of Lucretia and her brother over 19. Until then, I am Jimmy Mann with the historical sketches.